Brook trout are adored by tons of anglers. They're gorgeous, and the big ones can be extremely frustrating and rewarding to catch. But brook trout are also one of the biggest threats to the long-term survival of native fish like cutthroat trout. Brookies are more aggressive than cutthroat trout, so in places where the two fish live side by side, brookies can outcompete cutties for food. So to help cutthroat and other native fish like Gila or Apache trout, sometimes fisheries managers will ask you to kill brookies. Now, does killing brookies really help cutthroat? Is this a sound practice, or do fisheries biologists out in the West just have it out for brookies? Today on Untangled, we'll dive into all of this and explain what really goes into conserving and protecting our native fish. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Flyco. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. Today's topics are really interesting because there's a lot of strong opinions on both sides of this debate about protecting and conserving native fish versus just managing for what's already here and arguably thriving here with the quote-unquote invasive fish. In our brook trout and even brown trout and rainbow trout are invasive to some areas of the West. But before we really dive into all of that stuff, let's just back up and start with like a 10,000 foot view about trout conservation, native fish, because that's really important to understanding why in some places in the Rockies and in some drainages, especially out here, it's legitimately encouraged. Celebrated might be a strong word, but it's legitimately encouraged in a lot of places to kill brook trout. So first thing we got to know about brookies is they are native to North America. And what that means is that they evolved and grew up and came into existence here. They're not native to anywhere else on the planet. And really their native range is on the East Coast from Newfoundland and Labrador all the way down to northern Georgia. That's where historically you could find them. Now these days, brook trout are dealing with a lot of habitat loss, habitat degradation, so they don't occupy all of that territory that they used to, but you can still find them in a lot of their historical native range out there where they grew up. Now, when you move out here to the Rocky Mountain region with our cutthroat trout, they were historically the dominant fish in a lot of the Rocky Mountains, with the exception of a few spots in Idaho and Montana where rainbow trout were native and where rainbow trout evolved a little bit into that Columbia River basin, because rainbows are native to stuff that drains into the Pacific Ocean and that whole coast from Alaska all the way down to Mexico. Then you've got Apache and Gila trout, which are native to the southwestern United States, and they're native in mountain ranges that, honestly, they're not really part of the Rockies or the Sierra Madres. They're kind of on their own out there in those areas. So before anybody came out and settled the West, the early American settlers, you had all these places where the native fish were hanging out, they were doing their thing, and they're other than the consistent cycles of nature and seasons and climate throughout the years and the millennia, however long they've been out here, nothing else was really bothering them. You had your rainbow trout and your stillhead in the Sierra Nevada and the Cascades, cutthroat, most of the Rockies. You had salmon all the way up to Redfish Lake in Idaho. You had native cutthroat all through Yellowstone, those giant cutthroat in Pyramid Lake that we talked about on an episode about a month ago now. Utah Lake also used to be home to like 20-pound Bonneville cutthroat trout. So really big fish just doing their thing, living in an ecosystem that was intact. They had access to spawning ground, they had access to feeding grounds, and they could move freely between all of that. But then when settlers came out here, they started diverting rivers for irrigation so they could survive and grow crops. And that ends up fragmenting a lot of the habitat. So spawning habitat was lost, access to spawning habitat was lost. And then on top of that, a lot of the settlers brought fish that they were familiar with. So brookies and brown trout came out here from the East Coast, and they got planted in a bunch of lakes and rivers and streams out here basically just got dumped wherever. Wasn't a lot of rhyme or reason to them. And no one at the time really understood what was going to happen. There wasn't this body of scientific research and evidence showing us what happens when you displace native fish. And the issue with introducing all these fish is cutthroat trout, especially, they didn't really evolve with too many other predators. They really only had to compete for each other for food. And then since a lot of cutthroat really evolved high up in the high country, in these remote drainages, they had short growing seasons. So they developed that ability to that tendency to eat a lot and to eat without studying and being discerning about their food in the way that a brown trout might be, because they had a short growing season. They had to just pack the pounds on when they had that opportunity. And then in places where they weren't, in these small upper tributaries and drainages in like Pyramid Lake, Utah Lake, Yellowstone Lake, the cutthroat trout grew large, but they were also at or near the top of that predator food chain in a lot of those lakes as well. So they didn't really grow up with any other predators that they had to deal with in the water. Of course, birds and bears, they would eat them, but water-based predators, they were really by themselves. But then you get brook trout out here. And brookies are funny because when they get planted out here in the Rockies, in that early settlement period of the American West, it was like putting the brookies into nirvana. It was like releasing me into Golden Corral with my mother-in-law's credit card to pay my way through it, right? My eyes are going to glaze over. I'm going to be a happy camper about that. Because brook trout, they need cool, clear, and clean water, and the Rockies have tons of that. And streams and lakes in the Rockies also tend to be more fertile. They've got more bug life than a lot of the places where brook trout evolved. So that you pair that with the fact that brook trout can reproduce very rapidly. And what happens is you start to see that the brookies are much more aggressive than our native fish out here. They eat more aggressively than cutthroat trout. So they'll actually outcompete cutthroat for food. And then when you combine how aggressive they are with eating and their ability to just reproduce, like they put rabbits to shame. That's how good brookies are at making more of them. What you do is you end up with their populations just blowing up in numbers. So there's tons and tons of brookies, and then they do what's called stunting because there's so many fish, but there's only so much food available. So they all grow to like 7 inches and they're skinny, but they've got giant heads because they're trying to eat as much as they can, but there's just only so much food available. And the brookies will do that to the point where they really do push out the cutthroat. The cutthroat just can't exist there anymore. They're not going to outcompete the brookies, so they disappear. They just move upstream or move downstream, or they just can't spawn successfully. They die from hunger because they just can't eat enough, and they just get pushed away and disappear. So when the brookies move in, it's not dissimilar to how carp can overtake water bodies. If you've been paying attention to any of the carp issues in the Mississippi River, for example, you see that played out very well there. So that's the big overview of the native fish, how they evolved, and then what happens when the brookies come in here. Okay. But what does that have to do with killing them? Okay, they're not native to the Rockies. They can outcompete cutthroat for food. They're great at overpopulating some waters. But again, why would we want to kill them? They're beautiful. They're fun to catch. And when they get big, they can be really, I think some of the fish that I've spent the most time trying to catch has been big brookies. And I've gotten skunked by big brookies more often than like anything else. So they can be really, really finicky when they get to that trophy size, especially out here in the Rockies. So again, why are we going to say, well, let's kill them? That's a good thing. Let's celebrate it. What's the thought process behind that? Well, there's 2 main reasons. Okay. And reason number 1 is you get rid of some of the brook trout, and it's going to make the brook trout fishing overall much better, because in places where the brookies get a big stronghold, they usually do end up stunted. Not all the time, but they usually they will just reproduce and overcrowd a place to the point where they're all those 7 inches long. And especially if you go up into the high country at all, it's really easy to find a bunch of small brookies, and none of them are very big. Finding a really big one in the high country, you got to get kind of lucky sometimes in a lot of ways. But when you remove a few fish out of a lake or a stream or whatever it is, then the food that's available suddenly gets split among fewer fish, and the fish that are there can grow to bigger sizes. And, obviously you don't want to do this everywhere, because there is something to be said for the opportunity to catch a bunch of brookies versus the opportunity to catch a few, but they're big. Not everybody wants to just go spend all day catching 1 or 2 fish, but they're 15 to 18 inches. Some folks want to just go out and catch a whole bunch. They don't really care if they're 7 to 10 inches, right? There's the different ways to enjoy this, and it's not always about big fish. So you want to balance it. You don't want to do that everywhere. But in places where you do take out the fish, you do end up with a better overall fishery if that's the goal that you're looking for. And just to give you an example, there's 2 lakes in Utah that I think of right off the top of my head here, where the brook trout, they can reliably grow up to like 4 pounds, and 6 pounds isn't uncommon in these lakes. And that's a legitimate trophy size. Anybody catching a 4-pound brookie, that's awesome. A wild fish, it's so cool to have that opportunity. But when fisheries managers started managing these lakes for really big fish, what they did is they actually put sterile brook trout in. So in the hatchery, they can sterilize the fish so they can't reproduce. And that allows the fisheries managers to very tightly control how many fish are in the lake, because if they can't reproduce, they can plant, X amount of brookies that are going to go ahead and theoretically, with the food available, grow to X size. And they actually, in both of these lakes, they ended up planting more fish than the lake could really handle to generate a lot of 4 to 6 pound fish, because they wanted to account for some harvest. They figure some anglers are going to catch a few and eat a few and take them home. But because catch and release fishing is so popular, the fish in both these lakes actually kind of stunted at like 2 to 3 pounds, which relative, right, is still an amazing fish. But compared to what the lake can grow when there's the right amount of fish in it, it was kind of disappointing. So they've actually had to adjust how many fish get planted in both of these lakes, adjust it down to account for the fact that anglers just aren't keeping and eating as many fish as we used to historically. And then in another one of these lakes, you're even encouraged to keep like up to 16 brookies a day to thin the herd, because they really want to just try and get the right amount of fish in there. And there's so many sterile fish in there that they're asking to keep, like 16 of them per day. So that's one reason, because in some places, harvesting brook trout will help the population be healthier and grow larger and give you a better angling experience if big fish is what you're after. It's not what everybody's after, and most game and fish agencies are pretty good at balancing that demand of opportunity versus trophy fish. And the best way to know, like, should I keep brookies from this place? Would it help? The best way to know that and to find that answer is to look in the fishing regulations for wherever you're fishing, because all throughout the West where I've been, it is noted in the regulations for that area that brook trout harvest is encouraged, or you don't want to harvest brook trout here because we're trying to grow really big ones. So it'll be very clear when and where they want you to harvest some of those fish. And I think just speaking on harvest too a little bit more, I know sometimes it's a little taboo to bring up in fly fishing. I get that, because a lot of us, it was Lee Wolf who said the best gift an angler can give another is to release a big game fish. It was something to that effect. I probably butchered the quote. But the idea is you let them go, they get bigger, someone else has the opportunity to then catch that fish. And it's awesome. But at the same time, there is part of fishing that's, our ancestors did. They fished for food. They fished to survive in a lot of ways. And I don't think the folks who enjoy eating the fish and who enjoy the harvesting aspect of it need to feel like they're not part of the fly fishing family because they like to eat trout. I like to eat trout. I don't eat as much as I used to, But, I'd still, every now and then I'll bring a couple of home, fry them up really good on, mashed potatoes or rice or whatever, or fish tacos, whatever I'm in the mood for. But I try to always make sure that my harvest is responsible. So am I taking them from a place that can handle it? Am I potentially upsetting how great a fishery is by taking 2 or 3 big ones out? Or am I, going to be content with a couple of the smaller ones? And just with that in mind as well, a lot of times I've found that the fish like 12 to 15 inches taste better than the big 20 inchers that are really fat. So this is my personal preference, but there's nothing wrong with keeping and eating fish. As long as you're doing it in a place where harvest is allowed and you're harvesting within the slot limits, honestly, you can make a really good argument for a lot of fisheries in the West that more harvest would help the fish size be better. Because again, it's how much food's available versus how many mouths to feed. So it's not, as long as you're doing it within regulations, I tip my hat to you. But that's the first reason, right? To kill brookies is in the places where we want to increase size and increase the trophy fish potential, harvesting them is going to help out with that. The second reason that you are encouraged to kill brookies in some areas is to conserve and protect those native fish. And when you look at cutthroat trout, they don't occupy something like 85% of their original habitat. So they're only in 15% of the waters that they used to be in before we came out and settled the Western United States. And they're still even on the landscape at all, that we're still able to fish for them. It's kind of a miracle. It's pretty amazing that we can still catch them and we can find some in pretty big sizes, considering how little space they occupy compared to what they used to. And brook trout and cutthroat, again, we go back to they want cool, clean, clear water. They both tend to occupy that very similar water. So brook trout become a threat to the cutthroat trout because they're going to occupy the same areas. And again, they're going to outcompete them for food and just completely push them out of the area. And that is an issue, not just because you lose the cutthroat, but you also lose those genetics. And one of the big keys to thriving populations of fish is that there's genetic exchange when they start to spawn. So if there's a group of fish that live lower in the river, a group that lives in the middle of the river, and a group that lives high in the river, when they all migrate to spawn, and they all usually spawn in the same areas, all of those fish that have a little bit different life histories are exchanging their genetics, and the population is surviving off of its strongest members. And that's ideal. That's what you want in a good population of fish. But when you get so many fish displaced and they're so fragmented, that genetic exchange diminishes and the fish just aren't as healthy and as strong and able to adapt as they would be if those populations were bigger. So getting rid of brook trout in places where they shouldn't be really does help those native fish thrive. That's why you'll hear about fisheries managers treating sections of stream to kill all the fish, remove all the brook trout, and then stick cutthroat trout back into them. And they're not doing it because they hate brookies. They're doing it because they're trying to establish those populations of cutthroat that can persist with that genetic diversity well into the future. There's this misconception out there that a lot of biologists hate brookies, just want to get rid of all of them and native fish everywhere, and that's all we want. And I'm lucky to know a few biologists very well as personal friends, and the amount of hate they receive on this subject is really kind of fascinating, how many people feel so strongly about it. And I get it, because you fish this stream forever and it's brookies and it's fun and it's nostalgic, and then it gets killed off one day and they put cutthroat in it, and the cutthroat, maybe they don't fight as hard or they don't look as pretty as the brookies. And I understand that, and it's kind of frustrating. And I'm certainly not advocating that we get rid of every single brook trout and replace them all with cutthroat for a couple of reasons. First, it's not feasible. I don't think it's possible to do that. And second, the brook trout are a fun fish to catch on the landscape. What I personally, if I was in charge, right, I'd want a balance of let's have some cutthroat and let's have some brookies. And I'll give the benefit of the doubt to a lot of fisheries managers out here in the West that that's also what they're trying to achieve. But then on the flip side of that, there is, mandates from Endangered Species Acts and others laws like that they do need to try and restore cutthroat trout habitat. So some of it is stuff they just kind of have to do. And if we don't like it, then it's our job as anglers to show up to the meetings and say, hey, what can we do? How do we change this? How do we keep more brookies or get more cutthroat, whatever camp you fall into? But just speaking personally, the opportunity to catch native fish in places where they've been historically, that's really cool for me. It's the closest I think I'll ever get to time travel, because I've always been obsessed with, I would love to go back to 1850 and explore the Rockies back then, before there were any big settlements out here, before we really, got into too much, 1840s actually be better. And just see what it was like and see what the fish were like, and just be able to have that experience in untrammeled wilderness and really, really be in a wild place. I'd love to have that opportunity. And unless somebody out there has figured out time travel and y'all want to share it with me, please do. I'd love to go back and have that moment, but I probably won't. So the next best thing is catching native fish in places where they've always swam. That to me is a really cool look back at where this area was. And then it does give me hope that we'll be able to keep these fish around for the future. But there's a value in that, in having these fish where they belong. Just from a selfish perspective, I love that opportunity to catch these fish where they grew up and where they evolved and where they turned into the fish that we love. And then just on top of that too, there's also an ecological impact of having the native fish back on the landscape where they belong. If you look at Yellowstone, really interesting case study there, because cutthroat trout, they spawn in the spring, and historically they were spawning right after grizzly bears woke up from hibernation. And so spawning cutthroat in Yellowstone were a huge food source for grizzly bears. And when the fish started disappearing, when the cutthroat started disappearing because of the lake trout introduction into Yellowstone Lake in the 90s, that historical food source dried up. So the grizzlies had to adapt to a different food source. And then all the other animals that benefited from that, from the fish carcasses the grizzlies left behind and the grizzly activity, because, and this will sound kind of gross, right? But they'll eat and then they'll poop and they'll redistribute nutrients throughout the ecosystem. That's a very misunderstood part of it, right? They'll actually move nutrients throughout the ecosystem by eating the fish here and pooping the fish out over here. But there's all of that exchange going on. And then things like, mink and otters, their populations nosedived because the cutthroat disappeared. And now that the cutthroat have made a pretty decent return, they're not back in huge numbers, but they're there. The lake trout suppression efforts are definitely working. Now we're starting to see grizzlies eat cutthroat trout again while they're spawning. They're taking advantage of that. And then a lot of those mink and otter populations have rebounded as well, which means the other critters that predate on mink and otters and that depend on mink and otters for their spot in the food web, they're doing better now too. There's a lot of interconnectedness in all of this that usually goes unnoticed when all we look at is, oh, I'm upset that the brookies are gone. Right? There's usually a lot more at play than just, let's kill all those brookies. There's this desire to try and replicate what we've seen happen in Yellowstone in other places where we can and where it's possible. So that in a nutshell, and I'm sure that was like a fire hose, but that in a nutshell is why it's celebrated to kill brook trout in some areas. Because in some places where they're trying to make these habitat restorations, getting rid of the brook trout gives the cutthroat or the other native fish a better chance at surviving and at reestablishing all those complex food and ecological webs that are weaved through our wild places. So hopefully that was informative and helpful, and hopefully you found something interesting in that. If you did, if you like that, if you want to hear more stuff like this, definitely drop a comment. I'd love to hear about it. But it is time to move on to the Q&A portion of this week's episode. Every week here at Untangled, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourselves. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, there's a link to send those in down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. Jason from Arizona has our first question, writes in and says, I have two questions. I've just started fly fishing and have been practicing safe catch and release methods. My question is about ethical catch and release because an employee at my local fly shop recommended pumping the stomach of the first fish you catch to see what the fish has been eating to help pick fly patterns. Is this ethical, or are you putting too much stress on the fish and increasing the chance of not surviving? My second question is about trout's vision. Another fisherman who ties flies told me to check my flies with a UV light to see how it looks because trout can see UV light spectrum very well. Is there any relevance to this? Jason, great questions. And if you want more info about the UV light thing in particular, I'm going to answer it here too, but Monday's audio-only show that you can find on Spotify and Apple and wherever you get podcasts, we talk all about how trout see colors and stuff. So, and that's gone into in tons of detail there. So definitely go listen to that episode if you haven't. But let's talk about the stomach pump. And for those who don't know, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's basically this little turkey baster looking thing. You catch a fish, and the idea is you catch the fish, you shove that little stomach pump down their throat, and you pump it a couple of times, pull it out, and then you squeeze it out onto your palm, and you can see like, oh, there's a mayfly nymph, and there's a caddis nymph, and there's some scuds, and there's, oh, that's a rock that fish ate, or whatever it is. That's the general idea behind stomach pumps. Now, I think they're absolutely ridiculous. They're about as ridiculous as boneless wings, right? That's not a wing, that's a chicken nugget. Call it what it is. Okay? Stomach pumps, I don't think they should be used. I think they're unethical. And unless you plan on keeping the fish to eat it, I don't think you should be using them. The fish work hard to eat that food, and you're literally just pulling it out of their guts. And you think, if someone did that to me, that ain't going to be pretty. Not just because I like my food and I'm a little hefty. You know, it's not a pleasant experience for the fish. And there's that, we got to fact check this one time, but that urban legend that, fish don't feel pain and they just feel discomfort. Well, even if that's true, even if they really don't feel pain, to just yank all the food they've eaten out of their stomach, that's still not good for the fish. And then on top of that, we talk a lot about how important it is to treat trout well, to keep your hands wet when you release them, handle them as little as possible. Stomach pump is literally doing the opposite of that. It's handling them more than you actually need to. And I don't understand this justification that people make for it by saying, hey, I want to know what the fish is eating. Well, okay, walk me through this. You already caught the fish on a fly that imitates an aquatic insect. So therefore, you know that at the bare minimum, that fish is eating that fly that represents that aquatic insect. So why do you need to pump the stomach to figure out what they're eating? You've already figured out what that fish is eating because you caught it. It's just that part of the argument. It's short-sighted and it's ridiculous, in my opinion. I apologize for getting so fired up, but it just doesn't compute for me that, oh, well, it ate this and I don't know what it's eating. Yes, you do. You already know what it's eating. I think it's ridiculous that stomach pumps are still something that's being used and that's recommended by fly shops. I just think it's irresponsible. Okay. If you really want to know what fish are eating and you really want that opportunity to better match your flies to the food that they're probably snacking on, then you need to become familiar with the bugs, when they hatch, and what they look like. And a great way to do that, we've got our field guide. It's completely free. It does no harm to fish at all. And it's a waterproof, spiral-bound little book that goes into any pack. And it gives you all the major aquatic insects that fish eat, what they look like, the patterns we recommend, their life cycles, all of that stuff, so that you can match what you're seeing on, in, or around the water to those fake flies in your box. And this is the best way to learn what the fish are eating and to figure this stuff out. And again, it's completely free. You just pay the shipping and we send it on over to you. We want you guys to have this resource. So I'll definitely throw that link in the show notes, or there'll be a QR code here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast as well. But I've been fly fishing for 20 years. I have never needed a stomach pump in those 20 years. The best anglers that I know personally, that I have fished with a lot and respect and have learned a lot from, none of them use stomach pumps. Because again, I wonder what the fish is eating. Oh, I caught it on a mayfly nymph. Well, I think it's eating mayflies. It's not, it's just an unnecessary step and an unnecessary bit of handling for the fish. So it just, I'll quit going on about it. I could do a whole show about why to not to, apparently. All right. My answer to your next question is not going to be as angry, I promise. So, trout do see colors we do, but not in the same way that we do. Their perception of it's a little bit different. To condense it down, they really see purples and reds the best. That stands out the most, and that provides a lot of contrast to them. They can see the UV light spectrum when they're younger, but older trout, as they grow up, they lose that sensitivity to the UV light spectrum. So it's not that the UV light itself is this secret sauce to your flies, and it's more so the reflection and the way that it bends light and can help your flies stand out. Because what you're really going for with your flies is contrast. That's why, all these hot spots on flies are so popular, because they add a little bit of contrast that helps your flies stand out, especially if there's a lot of naturals on the water. And then the fish can swim over because they see it. They're like, ooh, that's shiny. I'm going to take a gander at that. And they get over to it and they realize, oh, size and shape are right. I'm going to eat it. It's not that the color or that the UV material is doing anything fancy, other than it's just adding contrast to stand out from all of the naturals that are on the water. And so there is something to it. It does help. It does give your flies more visibility in the water, but I wouldn't say that it has to be in every single fly pattern that you use or that you tie either, because think about how many people caught tons of fish and tons of big ones before we started using UV fly tying materials. We always hear that, back in the day, the fishing was easy and they were all 10 pounds. It's probably not always true, but there was less pressure and more giant fish, in theory, in the quote unquote good old days, whenever you want to call that. And people still got fish just fine. So, and they still do, right? We still use natural patterns like an elk ear caddis, a parachute Adams, a hare's ear, a pheasant tail, stuff that doesn't have the UV dubbing or chenille or yarn in it or whatever it is. So I would just, it's useful. I'm not knocking. I'm not saying that it's not effective. It definitely is, but it's not something that has to be on every single fly to make it or break it as a pattern as to whether it'll be effective. It's just another tool to help your flies stand out a little bit more. So hopefully that answers your questions. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to holler a little bit. I appreciate it a bunch. Thanks. Forrest from Montana has our next question, writes in and says, I have a several-day camping and fishing trip coming up in mid-September. I've got my fingers crossed for the 4 trout plus grayling Grand Slam. Weather depending might be a fall streamer bite, maybe still summer hoppers. It's hard to say this far out, and assuming the flows/temps are even fishable then. If not, we may go explore alpine lakes instead. 2 of us are new dads and have hardly been fishing for a couple of years, so we're excited. My question is, do you have any fish camp traditions you'd recommend? Shore lunch recipes, secrets for drying waders in camp? What might you do to best take advantage of this trip? I've dug out my vise and am busily knocking the rust off, tying to refill my fly boxes. Hoping to maybe make a tradition out of this and one day bring the littles along. Thanks for all the insights and info. Love having this podcast to keep fish on the brain even when I can't go myself. Forrest, is a really good question. Thanks for sending it in. Really, it all depends on the kind of camping that you're doing, because if you're camping next to the truck, and you can haul in cooking gear, one of my favorite things to do in camp like that is to bring a Dutch oven in, and then I'll do a Dutch oven peach cobbler. I love that dessert after a long day on the water. It's relatively simple to make too. I just bring a box of yellow cake mix, some oil, the eggs, and then a can of peaches. And then I'll line the Dutch oven with foil. I'll put the peaches on the bottom, the cake mix on the top, and I just cook it till the cake's cooked through. And it's fantastic. It's a great little treat to have if you're, doing the car camping route. If you're backpacking in, I do like to break one of the rules of backpacking and throw a can of soda in. And I'll have that for the first night in the camp. And then some sort of dessert too. I like just having a little bit of extra sugar and calories after that first day of a longer trek somewhere. Because the first day tends to be the toughest for me. It's the one where I realize, oh man, I'm out of shape. I'll just bring something easy like a brownie or a cookie or a Danish from the gas station to go along with the soda. So that's what I'll do if I'm backpacking. The other thing that I like to do with car camping, and my buddy Ryan McCullough really turned me onto this, is I get a package of Falls brand bacon, which is the best bacon that money can buy. I'm not aware of a better brand of bacon anywhere in America. It's thick cut. It's really well seasoned. It's just perfect. And I'll get up in the morning, I'll make breakfast, I'll fry the bacon first, and then I'll scramble the eggs in the bacon grease in the same pan. And it's just a fantastic breakfast to start things off. And then another little tradition that Alex and I have actually started doing is quesadillas on just a little flat top Blackstone that we bring with us if we're car camping, which usually we are. We'll set up a base camp with the trucks and the gear, then we'll hike or wheel into somewhere if we need to. But just pre-cook the chicken, and then you bring whatever else you want to go in it, beans, rice, cheese, whatever else, all the sauce and the tortillas, and those cook up super quick, and they're great. I look forward to them every time we go. I really look forward to Alex cooking for me. That's probably my favorite part. He's a really good camp cook, so it's been pretty good. And we do stay away from tinfoil dinners because the last time we tried them, we couldn't get them to cook through. It was terrible. It was really embarrassing. Previous Eagle Scout Spencer would be very ashamed at my inability to do a tinfoil dinner. And that was just last year, I think, that we failed on that. So the quesadillas are fun. As far as any other tips for this kind of trip, I just hang my waders to dry at night, either over a tree branch or over the side of the truck, depending on where I'm at. The other thing I do is I always put my fly rods up. If I can lock them in the truck, I will. If not, I'll break them down and put them back into their tubes, because I haven't had this happen to me, but I've had it happen to friends, and I've seen it happen. Chipmunks and squirrels will eat the cork because the salt from the sweat in our hands and all the oils and stuff, it smells so good to them, they just can't resist it. So they'll actually come eat your cork all night long. You wake up to your cork just gone. And then, yeah, you can still fish, but you don't really have anywhere to hold. It's not super comfortable. You don't want to have that happen to you. So I always put my fly rods away so that I'm not inadvertently feeding the chipmunks and getting them hooked on cork, because that's a diet that's unsustainable, really. Cork only grows in Portugal, to my knowledge. So the poor chipmunks, man, they're hooked on something they'll never get another taste of unless they become rabid and start like stalking anglers and just nibbling at the cork every chance they get, which I wouldn't put it past squirrels to actually pull that off. If you've ever been to a national park and watched the squirrels raid the trash cans or beg the tourists for food, man, they're smarter than we give them credit for. Those little critters are. I'll tell you what. Last thing for you, as far as taking advantage of the trip, just don't put any pressure on it. Alex and I lately, we've been doing a lot of trips to film and to make content for you guys, and it got to the point where we were doing so many, we were gone so much, it felt like there was pressure on every single trip to just hit a home run, to catch a big fish, to capture the most amazing footage we can, to teach as best as we can. And it got to the point where the pressure was so high that if something didn't go right, if something just didn't pan out according to plan, we'd get frustrated and it would almost derail the entire mood of the trip. And it's been really tough to work through that, actually. We've had to step back and reevaluate how we film our content and what we're trying to do when we're out there and how many we're trying to do as well. We want to be able to have that balance of fun adventures, but not, burning ourselves out on it either. So just go out there for the fun. That was a good lesson for us, right? To just go out there for the fun. Okay. And don't overthink it. Don't try to make the trip success dependent on whether you catch a big one or a whole bunch of fish or not. Just the trip is the trip. The fishing is the fishing. Let those things be what they are and enjoy them for what they are. That's the best advice I can give you. So hopefully it helps. Appreciate it a bunch. Thanks. Mike from Utah has our next question, writes in and says, "Hey guys, love the podcast. I've learned a lot from all the content you've produced, and I can't thank you enough for doing what you do. As a novice angler, I often get to a very fishy-looking piece of water and start casting. I always try to match the hatch and pay attention to my depth and presentation, and despite a few snafus, tangles, and bad casts, I feel like I'm getting a good drift eventually. My question is, how can you tell if you've spooked or put the fish down? Unless you see the fish hightail it out of there, are there any tricks to knowing you've spooked the fish in a piece of water? If so, should you move on or wait? Thanks again, and tight lines." Mike, so you're right about knowing immediately if you've spooked the fish because you'll see them swim away, right? If the water is clear enough that you can see the fish and you can see them swim away, then you can usually get a pretty good idea on whether they're spooked or put down, which means they know you're there. They just don't want to eat because they've been caught enough. They're like, if we don't eat enough, he'll go away eventually. And then we can move back to the feeding lanes, right? If they stay really tight to the bottom or they stay huddled together and they don't move, and no matter how many good drifts you put in front of their face, they just don't react to them, that's a really good chance that, yes, they know you're there. They're not necessarily spooked in that they ran off to go to a different spot in the river and hide out somewhere. They're just trying to wait you out. Now, you can try and wait them out and try and just sit there and wait until they get comfortable with your presence and try and catch them. That's not personally my favorite way to do it. I would rather move on and just catch fish that I haven't spooked. That's just my personal preference. There's nothing wrong with either approach. That's just what I like to do the most. So you definitely can't sit there and wait for them if you want. But if the water is not clear enough and you can't see the fish and you're having a hard time, I don't know if I spooked them, I don't know what's going on, then we can go back to one of the rules of thumb that we've talked about here on the show a lot, which is people always want a number, and it's hard for me to assign a number to this because I just kind of do it by feel. But if I had to put a number on it, I would say get 10 to 12 drifts through the piece of water as best as you can. And make sure these are perfect drifts. Make sure if you're nymphing, your flies are at the right depth. If you don't have any drag, if you've got a dry dropper on, that you've done your absolute best to present those flies as perfectly as possible. Okay, if you do that and the fish still don't react, you're not catching anything, you could go to a fly change. And if you go to a fly change and the fish still aren't reacting to it, then that is a pretty good indication that you've spooked them and it might be time to move on. I generally don't go to the fly change unless I've fished 4 or 5, or again, I kind of do this by feel too. It's not always people want a number, and it's really hard for me to give a number because it's all just like, oh, okay, I feel like it's time to switch. But if I've fished 4 or 5 really good spots and I haven't touched a fish, I haven't seen a move on anything, then I'll go to a fly change at that point, because usually the issue is the presentation, not the fly itself. Fly choice is like 5% of it. Presentation's like 95% of it. You get that fly in front of fish, and as long as it looks real, they're usually going to eat it. The trout will, at least. So you could try all those different adjustments if you want on your perfect drifts. But if you put a lot of good drifts through there, and let's say you've adjusted the depth once or twice, still nothing, maybe you switch one fly out, still nothing, then yeah, it's probably a good sign that the fish just aren't willing to play anymore, and moving on would be worth your time. Again, it all depends on how much you want to sit there and really pick the water apart versus move on. Alex and I are kind of opposites in this regard. He really wants to work a spot and really just give it everything he's got before he moves on. I'm much more willing to move on quickly if I don't think those fish want to play, and I'll go find fish that look and see like they might be more willing. So there really is no concrete answer to how long you should move on or wait. It's all dependent on what kind of fishing experience you want for yourself. So hopefully that answers your question. Appreciate it a bunch. And it is now time to wrap up with our Live Real Life moment. Every week here at Untangled, we end the show by sharing a story and a picture from someone in the VFC audience who's out there living real life. We love to see what y'all are up to. So if you've got a live real life moment you would like to share with us, there's a link to do that down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. And this week's live real life moment is from Doug. After months of learning and tying flies, I finally bought my first rod this weekend and got on the water. No one on the lake my friend and I went to was fly fishing. In fact, a guy came up and said he's never seen anyone fly fishing there before. I didn't let that mess with my confidence. I've been watching your masterclass and podcast for a while. I took all I learned. I watched and saw minnows swimming around, so I tied on a woolly bugger. The fish were interested. There was a school of bluegill just past the drop-off. I tied on a zebra midge and an indicator, but still no bites. They were nibbling but not committing. One thing I noticed was they seemed to be interested in my indicator. So I tied on a parachute Adams. Thanks for the tutorial on that fly. More tying tutorials would be awesome. As soon as that fly landed on the water, they were eating it. I got 5 fish in 30 minutes. Granted, they were bluegill, but I caught them my first time out on the water and on flies I tied myself. Thanks so much for the masterclass. Doug, that's awesome. And it doesn't matter they were bluegill. Bluegill are fun. They're an underrated fly rod fish. They pull well. You get them in like a 2 or a 3 weight. You get a decent sized bluegill on one of those. It's a fun little rodeo. It's a good time. Bluegill fishing's a blast, and I don't do enough of it. So awesome story. Thanks for sharing it. And that's going to do it for us this week, folks. Thank you for being here, for watching and listening to the show all the way through. It does more for us than you could ever know. And if you really want to help us out, please, please, please tell everybody you know about the show. Spread the word, because our goal is to help you live real life. We want you to have these amazing experiences and a great time on the water and to learn and grow as an angler. And the more folks that watch our stuff, the more folks we can help do that. Okay, so that's our whole goal. So spread the word. I don't care if you got to use carrier pigeons or smoke signals or the Pony Express. Tell everybody you know. And until next time, everybody, get out on the water, enjoy yourselves, and live real life.